If culturally Christianity is in our neurosis, then our neurosis doesn't have to do with some hang up from the past. It has to do with the present situation that we're not adapted to. And the only way we can find a way forward is by going back and revisiting moments in the past where possibilities for this present are hidden. So when we talked about this last, which was some time ago, a couple months ago, we thought of going back into the past to find a way forward, seeds of Christian secularism. And the whole idea there is that we really don't know how to go forward because all the institutions have collapsed or are collapsing, or they've become redefined. I mean, I don't think the Catholic Church is collapsing, but it certainly has a very different role in society than it did like even 75 years ago. 75 years ago, whole communities were Catholic. And now, you have a little Catholic church in the corner where a small group of people who identify with Catholicism go, but there's no, it's pretty hard to find whole communities of Catholics anymore, or whole communities of Lutherans. So these institutions have all shrunk to the margins of our secular society. And the culture itself is no longer religious or identified religiously. And so, yeah, we have all the crisis of meaning that we described in the first two seasons. And so the idea was that Christianity is fully compatible with the secular age because Christianity is the self-secularizing religion. Christianity has existed without institutional churches, without religious orders, and without all these things, hospitals and so on. And therefore, in principle, there's no reason why it couldn't continue to exist once these institutions have served their role and disappear. Or even more strongly put, there's no reason why a Christian couldn't be fully secular if Christianity is the self-secularizing religion. So it gives us this idea that maybe there's a better way of being secular than the secularism on the go right now. Maybe there is a religious secularism or a Christian secularism that not only is something we have to construct, but maybe some of us are already actually living it. That was the idea. And then on the assumption that this is a completely new paradigm, this has never existed before, we go back to the past, not in order to reactualize some old form of life, because that's not on, but to see if we can find there like clues of how we go forward,
Yeah, I mean, as a psychoanalyst, all of this makes complete sense.
Yeah, so, I mean, if you think about your own life, like when you think about your life, we only understand our past as we move forward into the future, and different elements of our past suddenly assume relevance when there's a new challenge in the present that we have to deal with. We might never have even thought of that moment in the past. We might have completely forgotten it.
Yeah,
but and I mean, situation brings it out, right?
I think we see that all the time, and I see that all the time in the practice room. And I mean, what I like also with the Jungian approach to psyche and development is that, yes, we are looking back, but we're also looking at the present to see what it says about the future. It's not, all about just going back. It's about going back to see what it means for the present and for the future. Whether we look at a dream and it's about your mom, it also has something to say about why did you dream this dream now? And what does it point toward? This sort of more prospective attitude of Jung. So yeah, I'm with you.
In fact, I might want to say that really, if that's what Jungianism is, I'm happy to be Jungian. And I think it's the best idea that Jung has or had, and it's something well worth retrieving, that the real challenge for psychology is meeting the new challenges of the present, and that the neurosis is a conflict in our adaptation to the present. So it's not so much a trauma in the past that we drag around behind us like a ball and chain, but it's some way in which the present is challenging us to rise to a new selfhood, a new form of being the self that we are coming to be, and we're having difficulty. And so the difficulty pushes us back into the past. So it's almost as though the past only becomes a problem in the context of conflicts in the present.
I agree, and I think also actually Freud would agree.
Yeah, maybe. there's different Freuds, but certainly that seems to me Jung's idea of neurosis. And if culturally we're in a neurosis, Christianity's in a neurosis, which is probably a good idea, then to be a good assumption, then our neurosis doesn't have to do with some hang up from the past. It has to do with a present situation that we're not adapted we are not adapted to. And the only way we can find a way forward is by going back and revisiting moments in the past where possibilities for this present are hidden.
And where would we go back? I mean, where would we start to go back to the proceeds of secular Christianity?
So when we talked last, we spoke about going back to Rome in the 2nd century. I think I said the 1st century, but I think the 1st century is interesting, but the 2nd century is where I think we should land if we want to get. I mean, there's very few 1st century Christian authors in Rome, aside from the evangelists. The Gospels were being written in the 1st century. So, insofar as we want to go into the theological tradition that's after the Gospels have been sort of consolidated, we need to go to the 2nd century in Roman Empire, and then we can go from there. We were going to jump through history. Alexandria in the 3rd century, I suggested Belgium in the 13th century, Germany in the 14th century, and in each of these centuries, we were going to find a guide. That was the idea. So if today we wanted to talk about Rome in the 2nd century, what a challenge that is. I don't know how much people know about the ancient world. Probably some people know a lot and some people don't know very much. But when we think of Rome, I mean, the city of Rome at the center of the empire in the 2nd century, an empire that extended from, I guess, Spain all the way up to the Rhine River beyond the Alps in Germany, all the way over into the east, as far as what we now know as the Middle East and North Africa. This is a massive empire. And at the center was this great metropolis, Rome. And Rome probably had close to, had 1 million people living in it. We're not talking about a little backwater. This is not some kind of Dark Ages place. This is a very sophisticated and already old culture. And it's in this city and also the cities around it, around Rome, cities in the Roman Empire and in Asia Minor, that Christianity is spreading like wildfire. It's a very interesting feature of Christianity that it begins as an urban religion. It spreads in the cities. One city after another, little conclaves of Christians will break out. And it grows in that way until eventually, by the 4th century, Rome has become the religion of the whole empire. So this is one of the greatest transformations in all of human history, that this maverick sect that is originally persecuted, and it comes out of Judaism, and it seems to have attracted the people from the working classes and the lower classes, slaves and so on, would within 3 centuries become the religion of the whole empire. It's truly extraordinary. And the other thing that's extraordinary, of course, is that this religion espoused many values that were completely opposed to traditional Roman values. So it not only did it convert the Roman Empire, but it actually turned the Rome upside down. This is that little seed of truth in Nietzsche's point, that there was a transvaluation of values or a reversal of values. So whereas previously, might was right and power was more or less worshipped, now weakness is understood to be some kind of virtue, and the least among us are recognized as having dignity, or maybe even being the best among us. Virtues like compassion, and even the beginning of what we might recognize now as a human rights tradition develop out of this, in a culture that was based on brutality, authority, autocracy, slavery. So it's an extraordinary transformation. But if we go back before the conversion of the emperor Constantine in the 4th century into the 2nd century, we're into a really misty period where it's not entirely clear what's going on. As I said, the Gospels have been written, and the Christianity is alive and well, and there are figures who are active there, but we just have fragments from them, and we know that they were more or less working in an outlaw capacity. They had priests and they had bishops, but they were subject to random persecution, some which would be extremely violent, like Nero's persecution. Christians being fed to the lions, and we know that story, and some more sporadic. But in any case, they had no secure position in society. And the figure that really strikes me from this period is Irenaeus. He was the Bishop of Lyon in France. He originally came from Turkey. So his dates are 130 to 202. And all we've got left of his writings is a book called Adversus Heresies, or Against the Heresies. All the other texts have been lost. But he's a very interesting figure. He's seminal for orthodoxy, because what he argued for at that time, when Christianity still hadn't really defined the doctrine of the Trinity, what he argued for more or less became orthodoxy. But he's interesting for other reasons as well. One thing that really strikes me is that he is the last known living connection with the apostles. He was the disciple of a guy named Polycarp, who was martyred. Polycarp would have been a Christian teacher who was martyred. His teacher was martyred before him. And Polycarp was a disciple of John the evangelist. So John the apostle. And there is a tradition in the church that John lived to a long old age. Many of the apostles died as martyrs, but John lived to an old age. And we now assume that it wasn't the old man John who wrote the Gospel of John, but it could well have been one of old John's old disciples. It was because John founded a community, kind of Christian ashram in Ephesus. And so one of his disciples grew old and then wrote the Gospel of John. And so Polycarp is connected to that Johannine community. And then Polycarp is Irenaeus' teacher. So you have this kind of lineage. It's striking because those such connections are not common in early Christianity. The historical record has fallen apart, and there are all these gaps. And this might be a news to people. People still labor under the misconception that Christianity is a complete invention. But this is something that is deeply rooted in history. There are historical figures, historical events, and texts demonstrating these figures and events all the way back to the death of Jesus. So this is the most historical of all religions in a certain way, something I think we talked about in the previous seasons. So here we have a figure who's really close to ground zero, the Christ event. And he is a bishop during the persecutions of Marcus Aurelius, the emperor. Now, I don't know if you noticed, but Stoicism is really trending.
Mm-hmm.
And Marcus Aurelius, yeah, he's one of the great Stoics. He's a great writer. He's recognized to be a wonderful man, a great, wise emperor. He's a bit of a hero in our secular age. So we have to wrap our head around the fact that Marcus Aurelius was also someone who ordered the persecution of Christians, who at least was behind the movement to have women and children torn to pieces by animals in the Colosseum if they'd refused to recognize him as a god. So this is cognitive dissonance. How does this nice, wise, enlightened emperor, how is he behind such horrors? And I think it's a really interesting question. Why did a good man like Marcus Aurelius persecute Christians? Now, we should notice that he wasn't as nasty as his predecessors. Like Nero was a complete sadist. There's a story of Nero having a dinner party where he's got posts with torches on them to light up the room, but the torches are human beings, Christians, tied to the posts who are burning alive while they're having dinner. So Nero was a complete sadist. This is not Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius is a refined and educated, and he's a philosopher. He's the philosopher king. So why would he persecute the Christians, or why did he promote the persecution of Christians? And I think the answer is really interesting, and it might help us understand why this period is important for our age. The answer is simple. The Christians refused to participate in the imperial cult. So at this time in the history of Rome, the emperor was worshipped as a god. That was not always the case. Rome was a polytheistic culture, so many gods, but it seems that polytheism was deteriorating at this point. This is a jaded Rome, a Rome that's becoming unfaithful, you could say, or maybe disbelieving. The practice of venerating the gods is decaying. And the emperor at this point becomes the center of a cult in which he is recognized as a god. and every Roman had to pay some kind of tribute to him as a god, and the Christians refused to do so. Now, the Christians were otherwise very law-abiding. They were good people. They paid their taxes. They didn't cause a ruckus. They seemed to be utterly innocuous. They worked. They didn't make a big fuss about themselves. They weren't trying to set up a new government. They didn't even encourage revolution. But they refused to recognize the emperor as a god because that would have been some kind of religious blasphemy on it. And they even refused to the point of death. Now, many of them, of course, did, under torture, cave in. But many also didn't. I mean, these are the great martyrs, horrible tortures that they were subjected to on pain of death to recognize the divinity of the emperor. So obviously Marcus Aurelius doesn't think he's a god. He's not a god. He knows he's not a god. Why is this so important? And I think it's because Rome was conscious of how precarious its political power was. That is, this is this massive area with all kinds of different people living there, huge plurality. It could break apart at any moment. What holds it together? Well, what holds it together is the centrality of the single authority or the sovereignty of the single authority, a little bit like Putin's Russia, or Xi's China. These are also massive pluralistic empires, lots of different people, different religions. But it's absolutely central to Xi in China and to Putin in Russia that his authority is uncontested. And I think Marcus Aurelius recognized this, that unless his authority was sovereign, uncontested, unconditional, the whole empire was threatened. So Christians then were, in a certain way, upstarts. They were introducing a note of possible political destabilization into a system that really had every reason to worry that it would fall to pieces if people became suddenly, let's say, disaffected with the government. And so I think that Marcus Aurelius sees that the Christians are, however, politically neutral they seem to be, are actually a seed of possible dissent, not just dissent, but a destruction of the whole empire. The other thing he didn't like about them is the same thing he didn't like about other religious groups. They were very secretive. You could do what you wanted in Rome as long as it was in full view. But if you started having secret little meetings on Sunday morning behind closed doors with all kinds of riffraff and aristocrats having dinner together, talking about God knows what, you just get little glimpses of it. Apparently they're going to eat each other's flesh and so on. Then Rome has reason to be worried, because these little secret hives of alternative forms of social organization are the seeds, possibly, of insurrection. So that's why Marcus Aurelius was persecuting the Christians. That's why he tortured Polycarp and killed him. And that's why Irenaeus was constantly living, with the threat of torture and death and dealing with the congregation of Christians who were professing their faith at risk of their life and limb. Now, that's obviously nothing like today's situation. But we are in a situation today, however, when political ideology, political uniformity, and the rise of authoritarian states is all too real. Post-pandemic, the return of authoritarianism. The authoritarian regime is always based on the idea that the sovereign is unconditionally the master. And this is what Christians could never agree to.